There was once a king who changed wives like clothes. One day he'd promise forever. The next, her crown was gone, and sometimes so was her head. His name was Henry, King Henry the Eighth. And I was there. My name is Thomas. I was a servant in his palace. I folded his robes, lit the hallway candles, and stood quietly in the shadows as queens came and went, some with smiles, some with tears, and some with their final breath. Now I'm an old man. The palace halls are empty. But at night, when the fire grows low and sleep tiptoes in, I remember it all. The feasts, the laughter, the silks and jewels, and the silence that followed when a queen fell out of favor. Tonight, I'll tell you everything. Not in a loud, frightening way. No, this is a bedtime story. A soft one, a sad one, a true one. So pull up your blanket. Close your eyes. Let the candlelight flicker as I speak. And I'll take you back to the time of a king who could command anything except his own heart. I first entered King Henry's service as a boy in the year 1509. England buzzed with celebration that summer, for our new monarch, 18-year-old Henry VIII, had taken a bride. Her name was Queen Catherine of Aragon, and she was of regal Spanish blood. I was only 12, tasked with carrying trencher bread and wine at the coronation banquet, but I remember how radiant the royal couple appeared. Henry was tall and athletic, copper-haired and broad-shouldered, cutting a fine figure in cloth of gold. Catherine, though a few years older, was lovely and composed, with auburn hair under her jeweled hood and kind, pious eyes. The court rejoiced at their union. We all believed in those days that a golden age lay ahead. From the first, Queen Catherine treated those around her with gracious warmth. As a trusted lady-in-waiting guided her through palace corridors, Catherine would pause to smile at me and the other young pages. "God bless you, lad," she said once, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder after I bowed clumsily. Her voice was musical and her accent faintly foreign. I blushed, mumbling an oath of loyalty which made her laugh softly. To me, a mere servant, Catherine was an angel on earth, patient, devout, and motherly. In her chambers at Greenwich Palace, she kept a small altar and spent hours in prayer. Yet she also loved music and often led the ladies in singing Spanish lullabies in the afternoons. Sometimes I would linger by the open door just to listen. The sweet notes drifting through the summer air like a blessing. King Henry seemed utterly enamored of his new wife. In those early years, I often saw them walking arm in arm in the palace gardens. Henry would pluck a rose and tuck it playfully behind Catherine's ear, and she would blush as he kissed her hand. The king was young, vigorous, and idealistic. He delighted in tournaments and feasts, eager to impress his bride and his realm. I remember a grand joust held in 1511 to celebrate the birth of their first son, a moment of great joy. Henry rode in on a charger, armor gleaming, and Catherine watched from the gallery, her hands clasped in hope. But fate can be cruel. That infant prince lived only 52 days. When the little coffin was carried to Westminster Abbey, the Queen wept inconsolably. Henry, too, was grief-stricken, though he masked it with bravado in public. In private, I saw him pace and smash a clay goblet against the wall in anguish. Still, they consoled each other and prayed for God's blessing. "We must trust His will," I heard Catherine whisper to Henry in the chapel, her voice broken yet resolute. The king embraced her tightly, both of them in tears beneath the stained glass saints. Over the next years, Queen Catherine suffered many heartbreaks. She endured miscarriage after miscarriage, fragile hopes that bloomed and died in her womb like winter buds that never see spring. Each loss weighed on the palace. At night I could hear the queen's sobs echoing down the stone corridors from her chamber. During the day she hid her sorrow behind duty. Catherine devoted herself to the realm, acting as Henry's partner in governance. In 1513, when the king led an army to France, he appointed Catherine as regent in his absence. I vividly recall that summer. England itself seemed to test the Queen. The Scots invaded in Henry's absence, and Queen Catherine, bold and brave, donned armor to rally the troops. I was assigned to the Queen's retinue at Richmond Castle when news arrived of the English victory at Flodden Field. Catherine was overjoyed that our forces defeated King James IV of Scotland. In her exhilaration, she sent Henry a gruesome token of triumph, the blood-stained cloak of the fallen Scottish king. I saw her hold that ragged cloak with trembling hands, murmuring a prayer for the dead even as she thanked God for England's deliverance. Such was her nature, merciful and just, even in victory. Life at court under Queen Catherine's guidance was orderly and steeped in tradition. She upheld the old faith devoutly. We observed all the holy days and feasts with solemnity. Under her influence the king, who once wrote love songs and frolicked in masques, remained a good Catholic prince. Palace life, though grand, was virtuous and family-centered. Catherine was beloved by the common people, who saw her as a true daughter of Spain and England's gracious queen. I often accompanied her on charitable visits to London's poor, carrying baskets of bread which she distributed with her own hands. "We must care for our people, Thomas," she told me kindly one crisp morning as we passed out loaves in a muddy street. "Kings and queens are but servants of God's realm on earth." I never forgot those words. The great joy of Catherine's life came in 1516, when after so much heartbreak she finally bore a healthy child, a daughter, Princess Mary. The newborn was a tiny pink bundle swaddled in lace with Catherine's reddish hair. Though a son had been hoped for, both parents celebrated little Mary's arrival. The christening at the Franciscan chapel was lavish. Church bells pealed across the city. Henry lifted his infant daughter for courtiers to admire, pride shining in his eyes, and Queen Catherine, despite enduring a long labor, was radiant as she thanked God for this precious gift. I was but a teenager then, tasked with standing guard by the nursery door. Many nights I saw Catherine there, rocking Princess Mary by the glow of a taper and humming an old Spanish lullaby. The sight moved me deeply, the Queen cradling her child, her face aglow with motherly love and hope for the future. In those moments, all the previous sorrows seemed redeemed. But shadows gathered slowly. As the years passed, no prince arrived to secure the Tudor line. The king's desire for a male heir grew desperate. I could sense Henry's frustration mounting each time Catherine's pregnancies ended in loss or stillbirth. By the late 1520s, the king was nearing 40, and his once boundless patience waned. Though he still cared for Catherine, her beauty had faded with time and grief. She bore the lines of stress on her brow and walked with a slight stoop from so many years of fasting and prayer. King Henry, by contrast, remained a virile figure, tall and hardy, and he hungered for the promise of sons. I recall a cold evening in 1526 when, while cleaning the remnants of supper in the great hall, I overheard low voices behind a tapestry. Peeking through a gap, I saw Henry speaking softly with a dark-haired lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. She was laughing at something he said, her black eyes flashing. I recognized her as one of Queen Catherine's maids, recently arrived from the French court. At the time I thought little of it. The king was known to indulge in flirtations. But soon rumors swirled among the servants. The king's fancy for Lady Anne was no passing whim. Unlike other women, Anne Boleyn refused to become his mistress. She insisted on marriage and a crown. I witnessed Henry's growing obsession. He sent Anne secret love letters perfumed with his scent. He composed songs praising her beauty. In my duties, I would deliver gifts from the king to Lady Anne. A brooch, a small dog, letters sealed with Henry's H entwined with A each time. Anne accepted them with a coy smile, but still held him at arm's length. She was clever, understanding her power over him. Queen Catherine certainly noticed the change. By 1527, King Henry had begun speaking of his troubled conscience. He claimed that marrying Catherine, who had been briefly wed to his late brother Arthur, was a sin in God's eyes, citing the Bible that a man who takes his brother's wife shall remain childless. We servants knew this for what it was, an excuse. Henry needed a male heir, and Catherine, now in her 40s, likely could bear no more children. The king believed Anne Boleyn could give him the son he craved. Thus began the king's great matter, as it was cautiously called, the arduous effort to annul his first marriage. In 1529, a special tribunal convened at Blackfriars. I sneaked into the back of the hall amidst the throng to witness that fateful hearing. Cardinal Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio presided. King Henry sat sternly, and Queen Catherine, God bless her, knelt at Henry's feet before the whole court. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she made a heartfelt plea. "My lord and husband," she cried, "I have been to you a true and humble wife these 20 years, and I have loved all those whom ye loved." In that vast, silent chamber, her voice trembled with dignity and sorrow. We were all spellbound. She declared before God that her marriage to Prince Arthur had never been consummated, and thus she was no unlawful wife to Henry. Then, with a deep reverence to the king, Catherine rose and walked out, refusing to participate further. I saw Henry's face flush, with anger, perhaps, or shame, as his queen left the court, the train of her gown sweeping regally behind her. Many of us wept at her bravery. I pressed myself against a pillar, heart pounding. That day, Catherine won the love of the people, but it did not save her marriage. The Pope hesitated to grant the divorce, influenced by Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. Impatient and inflamed by passion for Anne, Henry eventually defied Rome. By 1533, he had broken from the Catholic Church and declared himself head of the Church in England. It was a monumental shift, one I scarcely understood then. What I saw with my own eyes was more personal. Queen Catherine was cast aside, and Anne Boleyn ascended in her place. One gray winter morning, the king's men came to remove Catherine from court. As a servant loyal to the queen, I found myself torn. I helped pack her belongings in wooden chests, rosary beads, prayer books, a locket containing a tiny portrait of Mary. Catherine's eyes were red from weeping, yet she carried herself with composure. She bade farewell to each of her household gently. When my turn came, I fell to my knees, unable to hold back tears. She cupped my cheek and whispered, "Do not cry, Thomas. Serve the king faithfully, that is your duty, and pray for me, as I shall for you." I could not speak, only nod. I remember the chill in the air as I watched Catherine depart under guard, wrapped in a plain cloak. Snowflakes landed on her dark veil. She looked back once at the palace that had been her home for so long, and then she was gone. King Henry did not even come to see her off. Catherine was sent to live in dreary isolation at Kimbolton Castle, far from the splendors of court. Princess Mary, now declared illegitimate and demoted to Lady Mary, was forbidden from visiting her mother. This cruel edict distressed both mother and daughter. We who had served them felt the injustice keenly. I later heard whispers that some of Catherine's loyal servants secretly smuggled letters between Catherine and Mary, though if discovered it would have meant the king's wrath. How it pained Catherine to be kept from her only child. The queen, for I never called her anything else in my heart, spent her final years in prayerful seclusion. She dressed in somber black and was often found kneeling on the cold stone floor of the chapel at Kimbolton, praying for hours on end. In January of 1536, word reached London that Catherine of Aragon had fallen gravely ill. Despite the bitter winter weather, I felt an urge to go to her, to offer any comfort I could. But I remained at Henry's court, bound by duty. On the afternoon of January 7th, 1536, as snow blanketed the fields, news came that Catherine had died. They said she passed peacefully, clutching a cross to her chest. She was 50 years old. When I heard the bells toll, I slipped away to a quiet chapel corner and cried for the kind soul who had been our queen. It was the end of an era, the end of Henry's first, longest marriage of nearly 24 years. King Henry's reaction was unsettling. Instead of mourning, the king and his new Queen Anne dressed in bright yellow attire the next day, a color of celebration in Spain, though some said Henry wore it as a joyful statement. I saw Henry in the great hall exclaiming, "God be praised that we are free from all fear of war," a reference to Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles. While some claimed it was a show of respect using Spain's mourning color, it felt heartless to those of us who loved Catherine. I could not join any celebration. In private, I lit a candle for Catherine's soul and remembered her final act of forgiveness. For just before she died, Catherine had penned a letter to King Henry, a letter of such grace and love that it brought tears to every servant's eye. In it, she forgave Henry for all the calamities he had caused her and implored him to care for their daughter Mary. "For my part, I pardon you everything," she wrote, "and I wish to pray God will pardon you also. Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things." Those words, I later learned, were Catherine's final message signed Catherine the Queen. When a copy of that letter secretly circulated among her former household, we wept at her saintly compassion. Even in death, she considered Henry her husband and prayed for his soul. Thus ended the reign of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. I cherish her memory, a woman of unshakable faith and gentle strength. She had loved Henry truly, and her only crime was failing to give him a living son. I often think that had Prince Arthur, her short-lived baby boy, survived, history might have been gentler to her. But history is written in iron and blood. Catherine was gone, and Anne Boleyn was now queen. The palace atmosphere had shifted. I dried my tears and braced myself for the changes that were to come. Little did I know how tumultuous and short Anne's glory would be, or how soon I would find myself recalling Catherine's era as a bygone time of relative peace. As the candle burned low that night, I murmured a prayer for Catherine and for England. The king's great matter was resolved, but greater troubles were only beginning. The court was reborn in glitter and tension under Queen Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. Where Catherine's rule had been marked by stability and tradition, Anne's brought an atmosphere crackling with change. I remember the first time I saw Anne after Catherine's departure. She swept into the great hall at Whitehall Palace, formerly York Place, with her head held high, dark eyes alight with triumph. Anne was striking rather than classically beautiful, slender with long raven-black hair and an elegance honed during her years in France. Around her neck she famously wore a string of pearls with a golden bee pendant, proudly declaring her identity. Many at court greeted her with forced smiles. Some still muttered that she was a usurper. But Henry's favor protected Anne like a gleaming armor. As one of the king's personal servants, I was now instructed to attend to Queen Anne as well whenever the king required it. Anne could be charming and vivacious. In the initial months of 1533, as she settled into queenship, she often laughed brightly and ordered music and dancing in the evenings. The king was besotted with her. I saw him dote on Anne, hanging on her witty remarks and indulging her every whim. She had a sharp mind and a bold spirit that excited Henry. Unlike gentle Catherine, Anne debated politics and religion with the king. She was a patron of reformist scholars and filled her chambers with ladies who shared modern, Protestant-leaning views. I confess this made me uneasy at first. The Latin Mass I had known all my life was now whispered against. Anne encouraged Henry to read New English translations of Scripture. We noticed fewer priests around court, and more eager young courtiers who followed Anne's fashion of French styles and French manners. Despite the lively veneer, the court's mood was anxious. England had split from the Pope for Anne's sake, and not everyone accepted Anne as rightful queen. Common folk still loved Catherine, and called Anne cruel names under their breath. I recall walking through London's market on an errand, and hearing a fishwife spit and say, "God bless good Queen Catherine, and damn the king's whore." I hurried away, hoping such words would not reach the king's ears, for they surely meant a quick trip to the Tower for the speaker. Anne herself was keenly aware that many wished her ill. At her coronation in June 1533, which was splendid beyond measure, I noticed Anne's eyes scanning the crowds intently as she rode by in a litter of white cloth of gold. She wore her heavy crown with pride, but perhaps she saw among the onlookers some turned backs or sullen faces. Henry, however, was determined to establish Anne as his one true queen. We servants were instructed to address her as such at all times, and any lingering loyalty to Catherine had to be kept to ourselves or risk punishment. Soon, our attention turned to what we all prayed would happen, the arrival of a royal prince. Queen Anne was with child by summer 1533, and the king was overjoyed. He spoke confidently of the son that God surely would now grant him. In preparation, Henry had elevated Anne before their wedding by naming her Marquess of Pembroke in her own right, a rare honor for a woman. Everything rode on this pregnancy. I remember the frenzy of preparations at Greenwich Palace in early September, when Anne's lying-in time came. A nursery was outfitted with silk tapestries depicting scenes of fertility and plenty. A tiny cradle of carved oak, gilded all over, was placed in the chamber, awaiting a prince. I, too, felt the excitement, hoping the turmoil of the divorce would be justified by a male heir at last. On September 7th, 1533, the long-awaited child was born. I was not in the birthing room, of course, but stationed just outside with other staff. When the midwife emerged, her face was curiously strained. "The queen is delivered of a healthy child, a princess," she announced quietly. "A girl." In the silence that followed, one could hear a pin drop. It was as if the whole world exhaled in disappointment. The king's adviser, Sir Thomas, coughed awkwardly and managed a smile. "Healthy, you say? Healthy is good." Soon a wail arose, the baby's first cry, lusty and strong. My heart gave a pang of sympathy for the newborn princess who was innocent of failing to be male. Henry was informed. His face, I later learned, fell for a moment when he heard the news. But by the time he entered Anne's chambers to see his child, he wore a broad grin. I admire that he did not show dismay publicly. He lifted the swaddled infant, named Elizabeth, and presented her to courtiers as our beloved daughter. There was polite applause. Queen Anne was pale and exhausted in bed, but she watched Henry anxiously, likely gauging his true feelings. The king kissed her brow and said loudly, "Next time, boys." Many laughed, and Anne smiled in relief. Yet I sensed an undercurrent of worry in her. She knew as well as anyone that her position remained precarious until she bore a son. Despite this setback, Queen Anne did relish moments of triumph. With Catherine banished and Lady Mary declared illegitimate, Anne had removed her rivals. She enjoyed a period of apparent victory. The court glittered with masks and banquets in those days. I recall one extravagant masque where Anne and her ladies danced in exotic costumes of silk, enchanting the king. Anne herself loved to dance. She moved with a graceful, swan-like motion and often led the ladies in French bronzos and almains. The king would watch her, eyes shining. At Christmas, 1533, I attended a banquet where Henry sat at the high table beside Anne, gazing at her as if besotted. They wore matching garments of deep Tudor green velvet. Anne teased the king in conversation, and he roared with laughter. To see them, one would think all was well. And indeed, there were tender moments. I once came upon them in the gardens at Hampton Court, the toddler Princess Elizabeth in Henry's arms. Anne was tickling the baby's chin, and the king was chuckling. A picture of domestic bliss, except that Mary, Henry's elder daughter, was conspicuously absent, living as a virtual prisoner in a separate household. Those who had served Princess Mary and remained loyal to her cause were quietly being removed or watched with suspicion. The shadows were there if one looked closely. As 1534 turned to 1535, Anne's situation grew more strained. She had become pregnant again in the winter of 1534, only to miscarry after a few months. The king's face darkened at that news. I remember bringing him a cup of spiced wine in his study that evening. He sat, staring into the fire, jaw clenched. "Why does God deny me sons?" I heard him murmur. No one dared answer. Anne, for her part, became increasingly anxious and, at times, volatile. Her temper, always quick, flared more often. Servants tiptoed around her for fear of provoking her sharp tongue. I once witnessed her scold a maid severely for misplacing a piece of jewelry. "Foolish girl, do you know what this necklace means? It's the symbol of my queenship," Anne cried, clutching her famous bee pendant. Then she sighed and dismissed the trembling maid with a forced laugh. "There now, go. I'm just in a mood." These outbursts betrayed her inner tension. The pressure to bear a son gnawed at her daily. The king's eye, alas, began to wander as Anne failed to produce an heir. By 1535, I heard whispers that Henry was drawn to one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, a quiet, fair-haired gentlewoman. I had seen Jane about. She was the opposite of Anne, demure, sweet-tempered, content to remain in the background. How ironic that the vivacious Anne now faced the threat of being supplanted by a woman as mild as milk. Anne grew aware of Henry's interest in Jane. I suspect this knowledge made her more desperate to please Henry and more fearful of losing him. Then came the year 1536, a year of calamity and turning points. It began with grim omens. In late January, news arrived that the ex-Queen Catherine had died, as I recounted before. Anne, rather tactlessly, rejoiced with Henry at the news, believing the death of Catherine made her position more secure. She even remarked that now they were free of the former queen's shadow. But only a few days later, on January 24th, 1536, King Henry himself suffered a terrible jousting accident. We were at Greenwich. The king, still asserting his knightly prowess at age 44, was tilting in the lists when he was thrown from his horse. I was nearby holding his cloak and saw it happen. The great armored horse slipped and fell onto Henry after he hit the ground. The impact was awful. Henry lay motionless. Speechless for 2 hours, some said. I thought he was dead. Shock and panic gripped us all. The king's men rushed to him, and I assisted in loosening his dented breastplate. His face was ashen, eyes closed. Courtiers wailed or sank to their knees. We carried the king to his chambers. I recall my arms shaking as I helped bear his weight. Miraculously, Henry eventually regained consciousness, but he was badly injured. His leg hurt and likely a head injury too. For days he was bedridden, mood swinging between agony and anger at his helplessness. Queen Anne, who was pregnant again at this time, was overcome with fright at the accident. Some said she nearly collapsed upon hearing Henry had been unhorsed and presumed dead. In her terror and grief, just 2 days later, Queen Anne miscarried a baby. Tragically, this had been a male child. I will never forget the sight of Anne that day. She was carried from her chamber on a pallet, pale as marble, silent tears flowing. The whole court realized the enormity of this loss. The long-awaited son was gone before he drew breath. When the king, still weak and in pain, learned of the miscarriage and that it had been a boy of about 15 weeks, his face turned stony. "I see God will not give me male children," he said coldly, according to palace gossip. Anne begged forgiveness, blaming the shock of Henry's accident for her miscarriage. Indeed, she told Henry that the fright had caused her to miscarry of her savior, her son. But Henry's disappointment ran deep. I recall a poignant scene a few days afterward. Queen Anne, recovered enough to walk, came to the king's bedside. I stood at the chamber's edge, ostensibly arranging medicine jars, but really I bore witness. Anne knelt by Henry and pleaded through sobs. "We have both been afflicted, your majesty. Do not forsake me. I will give you a son yet, I swear it." Her long dark hair, unbound, cascaded over the bedclothes as she implored him. Henry, leg bandaged and face drawn, gently touched her hair. "Stand up, Anne," he said quietly. She rose, hope flickering in her eyes. But Henry's next words were tempered. "We must accept God's will. Perhaps my sins stand in the way." I saw Anne flinch as he spoke. A chilly understanding passed between them. Something broke that day. The king's affection for Anne seemed to wane after the loss of their son. He grew distant, spending more time in solitude or in conversation with counselors like Thomas Cromwell. And, tellingly, Jane Seymour's presence loomed larger. There were rumors that, in grief, Henry found Jane's gentle comfort appealing. Spring of 1536 unfurled a series of increasingly dark events that sealed Queen Anne's fate. The change in the king was noticeable. Since his jousting injury, Henry's leg gave him constant trouble, an ulcer that refused to heal, and he became more temperamental. Some of us whispered that the accident had transformed him. Where once he'd been sporty and generous, now he grew cruel and suspicious. Certainly the turnover of wives accelerated thereafter. Anne, unfortunately, bore the brunt of this new, ruthless Henry. I began to hear sinister whispers around court in April 1536. The Queen was being watched. A faction, led by Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, seemed to be gathering evidence of some sort against her. It was almost unbelievable. Anne Boleyn, who had moved heaven and earth to become queen, was now under threat after only 3 years on the throne. My heart pounded when one May morning the palace was abuzz that several men of the court had been arrested. Musician Mark Smeaton, Sir Henry Norris, the king's close friend, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, even Anne's own brother, George Lord Rochford. The charges muttered were adultery and treason, accusations that Queen Anne had betrayed King Henry with these men. I could scarcely credit it. Anne, for all her flirtatious manner, struck me as proud and cautious about her position. To risk it with lovers seemed mad. Most at court suspected these charges were false, contrived by Cromwell or by those who hated Anne. But what we thought mattered little now. The machinery of royal justice had been set in motion. On May 2nd, 1536, Queen Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. That was a day of heartbreak that haunts me. I was present at Greenwich when the yeomen of the guard arrived to collect her. Anne stood in the center of her chambers, trembling but erect, as the warrant was read. Princess Elizabeth, not yet 3, was carried out by a nurse as Anne pleaded to bid her child goodbye, but her request was refused. The Queen's lips pressed into a thin line of despair. She donned a plain cloak, gone were her fineries, and allowed herself to be escorted away. As she passed by, our eyes met briefly. To my surprise, she spoke to me in a strangled whisper. "Thomas, pray for me." I bowed deeply, tears spilling, and she managed a sad smile before the guards led her off. How swiftly fortune's wheel turns. I thought of Queen Catherine's departure just 3 years prior. The symmetry was chilling, though Catherine at least left alive and hopeful. Anne was headed to the Tower under grave accusations. The fall of Anne Boleyn happened with dizzying speed. Within a fortnight, she was put on trial for adultery, incest, and treason before a jury of peers. It was a spectacle of misery. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, once Anne's youthful fiancé long ago, sat on the jury looking stricken. He and the others, under pressure, found her guilty on all counts. I later heard that there was no solid evidence, only coerced confessions and malicious gossip. Yet the verdict was never in doubt. The king wanted Anne gone. It is said even her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, pronounced the sentence with tears in his eyes. The condemned queen was to be executed by beheading. I felt ill hearing this news. Many did. Some who had called her a witch now pitied her fate. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold at Tower Green. I was not an eyewitness to her final moments. King Henry had not permitted the court to attend en masse, but accounts from those present reached us quickly. They said Anne met her end with courage and composure. She wore a gown of dark gray damask and concealed her famed long hair under a simple linen coif. Anne made a brief final speech, maintaining her innocence but accepting death with grace. Perhaps hoping to secure mercy for her daughter Elizabeth, she spoke generously of the king. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never," Anne proclaimed. These words astonished the crowd. To call Henry merciful as he stood ready to execute her was either profound forgiveness or subtle irony. I imagine a sad, knowing smile on her lips as she said it. With a swift stroke by a skilled French swordsman, Henry had granted her the boon of a sword rather than the axe. Queen Anne's life was ended. When I received the news back at Whitehall, I found a quiet corner and sat down, weak at the knees. How surreal it felt. Anne Boleyn, once the dazzling star of court, now headless at 35 or thereabouts. I thought of the motto she had taken at her coronation, "The most happy." How tragically things had turned. All 5 of the men accused with her, including her own brother, had been executed 2 days prior. The whole affair left the court in a state of stunned silence. That evening, as I lit the torches in the great hall, the king did not dine with any fanfare. Henry had sequestered himself at Hampton Court, avoiding public appearances that day. Yet, and here my soul shudders at the mercurial nature of kings, even as Anne's body lay fresh in the earth, Henry moved on. In fact, the very next morning Henry rode out to visit Jane Seymour, his new object of affection, and they became formally betrothed within days. It was later remarked that King Henry seemed relieved and cheerful after Anne's death, as if a burden had lifted. I struggled to reconcile the king I had revered with these cold actions, but I reminded myself that to Henry, Anne had become a threat, a treasonous wife who, rightly or wrongly, betrayed him. To his mind, perhaps her execution was justice or necessity. In any case, Henry wasted no time rewriting the recent past. He declared that his marriage to Anne had never been valid in the first place. Due to some pre-contract or witchcraft, various flimsy reasons were given. Thus, Elizabeth was now deemed illegitimate as well. My heart ached for the little princesses Mary and Elizabeth. both stripped of status by their father's decrees. That night, I dreamed of Queen Anne. I saw her walking in the palace garden at twilight, singing a sad French chanson. As I approached in the dream, she turned to me, tears on her cheeks, and whispered, "Tell the king I loved him." I reached out, but she faded into shadows. I awoke with wet eyes. Perhaps I had grown fond of Anne despite everything. She had been a vibrant flame that briefly lit all of our lives, only to be snuffed out by the very wind she helped stir. With Anne Boleyn's death, a chapter closed. 2 queens down, 1 divorced, 1 executed. I often pondered how Henry felt inside. Did he experience guilt, sorrow, or only determination to move forward and finally obtain the male heir that drove his every decision? I do know that after Anne's execution, Henry ordered the court to wear joyful colors and banned mourning attire, as if to signal a new beginning. But those of us who served through these dark days carried the scars in our hearts. I prayed that fate might be kinder to the next queen, whomever she might be, and to the king as well. King Henry was now a widower, in name if not in truth, and the throne beside him had become perilous indeed. Little did we know, a wedding was imminent, and with it, perhaps a chance at redemption for the king's fractured legacy. The very day of Cromwell's triumph over Anne, I saw him and Henry whispering over documents, likely marriage contracts. We servants braced ourselves, for change was coming yet again to the royal household. How I hoped the next marriage would bring Henry the son he so desired, and some peace to this tumultuous court. The transformation at court was swift after Anne Boleyn's dramatic fall. In a matter of days, the banners bearing Anne's falcon emblem were pulled down, and her initials scrubbed off palace decorations. By May 30th, 1536, King Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, making her his 3rd wife. The ink was barely dry on Anne's death warrant, and already the wedding bells rang out. I must admit, the haste made many of us uneasy, but we also understood the urgency. The king was determined to secure the succession with a male heir, and Lady Jane had captured his heart with her gentle ways. I remember Jane Seymour from her time serving Queen Anne. Jane had been a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, though she kept a modest demeanor in both courts. Fair of face with pale skin and light brown hair, Jane was not as educated or glamorous as her predecessors, but she possessed a quiet kindness and humility that set her apart. Where Anne was fiery, Jane was calm. Where Catherine stood on seniority and royal pride, Jane bent with soft-spoken deference. It was said that Jane's motto as queen would be, "bound to obey and serve." Certainly, she lived up to it in those early days. The wedding of Henry and Jane was a simple, private affair. I did not attend the ceremony, but as a household servant, I saw the couple after they returned to Hampton Court. Henry's face glowed with contentment I hadn't seen in years. There was something almost boyish in the king's happiness as he escorted Jane through the corridors, his hand over hers. "At last, Thomas, a true companion and wife," he remarked to me one morning, patting his new queen's hand. Jane blushed and lowered her eyes demurely. I observed their interactions with cautious optimism. Jane had a soothing influence on Henry. In her presence, he seemed to temper his volatile moods. She would gently urge him to rest his injured leg, or sweetly encourage him to forgive a servant's small mistake. And Henry, remarkably, listened to her. Queen Jane quickly endeared herself to the king's household, and to me. She treated us servants with warmth, often asking if we had eaten or if we were well clothed. One chilly evening, as I stoked the fireplace in the Queen's chambers, she kindly offered me a cup of spiced ale to warm myself. "Thank you, Your Majesty," I stammered, touched and a little surprised. No queen had ever done that. Jane simply smiled. It was her nature to be considerate. She also began to mend the torn threads of the royal family. The king's estrangement from his elder daughters weighed on him, I believe. Jane made it her mission to reconcile Henry with Lady Mary, Catherine's daughter, who had been living in misery since defying Anne Boleyn. With great tact, Jane asked Henry to show mercy to Mary. At first, the king bristled. Mary had been obstinate in not acknowledging Anne or the royal supremacy. But Jane's persistence, combined with Mary's own submission, Mary eventually signed a document accepting her father's supremacy and her own illegitimacy, bitter as that was, softened Henry's heart. By the end of 1536, Henry allowed Mary back to court. I witnessed the emotional day Mary knelt before her father to beg his blessing. Henry raised her up and kissed her forehead. Tears glistened in Queen Jane's eyes at that reunion. It was said that Jane's gentle peacemaking brought Henry's family some healing. Indeed, at Jane's urging, Princess Elizabeth, still a toddler, was also treated kindly and sometimes brought to court. Jane showed affection to both girls, even though they were not her own. This generosity of spirit made us love Queen Jane dearly. Yet, for all these positive changes, Jane's primary duty was clear: to deliver a son. The memory of Anne's fate lingered like a ghost. Everyone knew Henry's patience would not last forever if a male heir did not arrive. Fortunately, in early 1537, Queen Jane announced she was with child. The king was jubilant. Church bells rang across the land, and prayers were ordered for the queen's safe delivery. The whole court tread on eggshells to keep Jane from any stress or harm. I was assigned night watch near her chambers during the later months of her pregnancy. We kept the palace quiet and serene. Musicians played only the gentlest airs, and Jane's favorite dish of quails, which Henry imported especially for her, was served often to keep her nourished. In October 1537, as autumn leaves fell, Jane's labor began at Hampton Court Palace. It was a difficult labor, lasting over 2 days. The queen endured much suffering, I was told, but remained stoic and prayerful. Henry was on edge. He paced furiously in the chapel, imploring God for a healthy son. I, too, prayed fervently. All of England waited. Finally, on October 12, 1537, the cry of a newborn rang out, and a cheer erupted among those gathered. A prince was born. The long-desired son, Prince Edward, had arrived. Joy overwhelmed us. Grown men wept openly and embraced in the corridors. I myself slipped into a side alcove and whispered, "Deo gratias," thanks be to God. Henry's elation was unbounded. He lifted the tiny prince in his arms when we servants were allowed to glimpse the baby. I saw in Henry's eyes an expression of profound fulfillment and tenderness as he gazed on his son, a look I had not seen since his youth. We all noted how Henry insisted the baby be swaddled in cloth of gold and carried under a canopy of estate. honors befitting a legitimate male heir to the throne at last. In the days that followed, the court celebrated with feasts, jousts. Henry did not participate this time, mindful of his leg, and bonfires lighting up the night sky. Prince Edward's christening was a grand affair at Hampton Court. I recall the hall bedecked with tapestries, the font filled with fragrant water. Lady Mary, reconciled, stood as godmother and chief mourner. If the child had died, but fortunately those were just ceremonial titles. The king could not contain his pride as the Bishop of Winchester baptized the tiny prince. Trumpets sounded, and a Te Deum was sung in thanksgiving. When the ceremony ended, Henry, in an uncommon display of public affection, kissed Queen Jane before the gathered nobility, and declared her to be the mother of his son, and thus his true love. We all applauded. Some shouted, "Long live the Queen!" In that golden moment, Jane Seymour seemed to have achieved what neither Catherine nor Anne could: give Henry lasting happiness through a male heir. But fate's ledger must balance joy with sorrow. Our rejoicing was short-lived. Within days, whispers reached us that Queen Jane was taken ill. She had suffered a long, exhausting labor over 2 nights, and it left her weak. By late October, her health deteriorated, likely due to childbed fever, an infection that often struck women after childbirth in those times. I was among the servants maintaining a hopeful vigil outside Jane's chambers. Inside, the king and doctors did all they could. They prayed, kept her warm with blankets, and provided broth and remedies. Jane's ladies later recounted that Jane alternated between feverish delirium and lucid calm. In lucid moments, she expressed concern for baby Edward and even for Henry's well-being should she not survive. On the night of October 24th, 1537, the Queen's confessor was called. We knew what that signified. I saw King Henry emerge, eyes red, and he gave a brief, heartbroken nod, an unspoken confirmation that Jane was near death. Shortly after midnight, Queen Jane passed away, less than 2 weeks after giving birth, at only 29 years old. The grief that followed in the palace was unlike anything I had experienced. We had all come to love Jane in her brief time as queen, and the king's loss of his dearest wife, as he called her, was immeasurable. For the first time in memory, Henry donned black mourning clothes. When Jane's body was prepared for burial, Henry ordered a grand queen's funeral, something even Catherine of Aragon had been denied. Jane was the only one of Henry's wives to receive a royal funeral, a testament to Henry's esteem for her. I marched in the somber procession at Windsor Castle, holding a torch as we bore Jane to St. George's Chapel. Lady Mary walked as chief mourner, her face a mask of sorrow. The king did not attend. Custom forbade monarchs from attending funerals, but I knew Henry was nearby, cloistered in private grief. As the coffin was lowered into the vault, many of us wept openly. We were not only burying a beloved queen, but also the gentle heart that had briefly unified the fractured Tudor family. In the weeks that followed, Henry's mourning was profound. He secluded himself, rarely emerging except to visit baby Edward in the nursery. I recall entering the king's privy chamber to deliver papers and seeing him in an unguarded moment. Henry was gazing at a tiny portrait of Jane, tears glistening in his eyes. He noticed me and quickly turned away, composing himself. "She gave me my son, Thomas," he said hoarsely, "and for that I shall ever honor her memory." honor her he did. Henry would later decide that upon his own death he wished to be laid to rest beside Jane's remains, for he considered her his true wife, the one who succeeded where others failed. We all sensed that Jane held a special, untouchable place in Henry's heart. Even in years to come, he spoke of her with reverence. Life at court after Jane's death took on a subdued tone. There was a solemn quiet in halls that formerly rang with music. The king's court went into official mourning. Jane's household was disbanded. Her ladies departed with heavy hearts. Little Prince Edward became the center of Henry's world, and indeed the realm's future. But an infant could not provide companionship to a king. By 1538, Henry, now nearing 50, had grown heavier in body and slower in gait. The old leg wound often oozing and requiring bandages. He limped at times, leaning on a staff or an arm of a trusted groom. I often escorted him, and could smell the medicinal balms applied to the ulcer on his leg. The king's once fiery energy had dulled, tempered by pain and the weight of years. Still, his mind was sharp, and his will as strong as ever. I think losing Jane and gaining Edward all at once had deepened Henry's complexity. He was a man capable of great love, as he showed Jane and his son, and great ruthlessness, as shown with others, a mixture that made serving him both an honor and a peril. As 1539 dawned, one question occupied the minds of all. Would Henry marry again? Some hoped he wouldn't, wishing to avoid more turmoil, but Henry's advisers, especially Cromwell, urged another marriage to secure alliances and perhaps spare the king loneliness. I recall helping the king dress one morning when he sighed, "No woman will ever replace Jane for me." He then added pragmatically, "But England must have more sons." Thus, the search for a fourth wife began, and soon enough, it would bring a German princess to our shores, and with her, a new chapter of surprises. After a year of widowerhood, King Henry VIII reluctantly heeded counsel to take another wife. But this time, the bride would serve a diplomatic purpose as well as a domestic one. Thomas Cromwell, ever the strategist, sought an alliance with the Protestant states of Germany. Anne of Cleves, the daughter of a minor German duke, was recommended as a suitable match. Henry, who had never seen Anne, agreed to consider her based on a pleasing portrait by Hans Holbein that depicted a demure, pretty young woman. The portrait must have flattered her, for what followed was one of the more awkward episodes I can recall. In January 1540, Lady Anne arrived in England after a turbulent Channel crossing. The king, eager and anxious to see his new bride incognito, decided on a whim to surprise her at Rochester Abbey, where she rested en route to London. I was part of the small party that rode with Henry in secrecy. The king dressed down in plain clothes. It reminded me of a romantic troubadour's gambit, perhaps inspired by tales of courtly love. Henry hoped to witness Anne's unguarded reaction to him before formal introductions. When we entered her lodgings, Anne did not recognize the king. In fact, she seemed confused and rather alarmed by the intrusion of this big, burly stranger who tried to embrace her. Henry's plan misfired spectacularly. As I stood in the corner, I saw Henry pull back, visibly displeased. He had expected Anne to at least show delight or bow instinctively, but she did neither, perhaps owing to cultural differences or simply shock. Anne's English was limited, and she did not understand his words of greeting. The king forced a strained smile, then left abruptly, fuming under his breath. Privately, I heard him complain that Anne was nothing as described, that she was uncomely and had evil smells about her, and that he doubted her virginity, making crude insinuations. It was an unfair assessment born of disappointment. In truth, Anne of Cleves was not ugly, just not the polished court lady Henry had imagined. She was tall, with a round face and a gentle expression, modest and a bit timid in manner. But she lacked the courtly graces and fashion that Henry admired, having been raised in a modest, conservative environment. To Henry's eyes, accustomed to the sophistication of Catherine, Anne Boleyn, and even Jane's gentle refinement, Anne of Cleves seemed unsophisticated and dull. Nonetheless, duty and politics prevailed. On January 6, 1540, Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves at Greenwich Palace. The ceremony was straightforward. I could tell the king's heart was not in it. He looked dour throughout, scarcely glancing at Anne. Poor Anne! She tried her best to smile and play her role, but must have sensed Henry's coolness. Afterwards, as her servants settled her into the Queen's apartments, I overheard some of the yeomen gossiping that the king had muttered he felt as if he were married to a Flanders mare. It was cruel talk. Cromwell's alliance was proving personally irksome to Henry. The marriage went unconsummated, a fact Henry did not keep secret. He confided to Cromwell that he could not perform his husbandly duties with Anne, blaming her appearance for his lack of desire. Some of us quietly wondered if the issue lay partly with the king's own declining virility or lingering injury, but such thoughts were dangerous to voice. Instead, Henry insisted he found Anne so unattractive that he mistrusted her to be no maid, baselessly suspecting she wasn't a virgin, and thus felt repulsed. All the while, Anne herself conducted herself with dignity, seemingly unaware of the extent of Henry's dissatisfaction. She spoke softly, treated the king with respect, and enjoyed playing cards and dice, simple pastimes, in the evenings. I served at a few small suppers with the royal couple. The king was polite but distant, while Anne attempted small talk in her halting English. Truly, they never connected in language or affection. By June 1540, it was clear to all that this union was doomed. King Henry grew increasingly restless and irritable in Anne's presence. He took to spending more time apart, hunting or closeting himself with advisers. Notably, his gaze began to rove again, and fell upon Catherine Howard, a pretty young lady-in-waiting in Anne's household, also a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, making her Anne Boleyn's first cousin. I saw the old spark in Henry's eyes whenever the lithe, flirtatious Catherine danced or pranced about. That, I thought, boded ill for Queen Anne. Indeed, by late June, Henry was seeking a way out. Conveniently for him, it was discovered, or declared, that Anne had been pre-contracted to marry a European noble years before. This provided a pretext to question the validity of Henry's marriage to her. Anne, likely advised by those who saw the writing on the wall, offered no resistance when interrogated on the matter. In truth, I believe Anne was not blind. She sensed Henry's loathing, and may have been relieved at the chance of escape without angering him. She agreed that the marriage had not been consummated, and accepted an annulment meekly. Thus, in July 1540, barely 6 months after the wedding, King Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. It was said that Anne comported herself with such grace and compliance that Henry was grateful to her. He and she parted on unusually good terms. In exchange for her cooperation, Henry bestowed on Anne a generous settlement, Richmond Palace, a luxurious residence, and Havre Castle, which had once belonged to the Boleyns. He also honored her with the title the King's beloved sister, effectively treating her as a royal sister rather than a discarded wife. Anne remained in England, content with her estates and the freedom that perhaps she had never enjoyed before. I had occasion to see her now and then after the annulment, when she would visit court for special events. Anne seemed much happier as an independent lady than she had as queen. She always greeted the king respectfully, and Henry, to his credit, greeted her kindly and even jovially. It was a strange situation, from queen to honorary sister, but it worked. Anne of Cleves thus survived and thrived, ultimately outliving all the other wives, and Henry himself. We later learned she died in 1557, well after Henry. Many a courtier quietly admired her savvy. By yielding to Henry's wishes, she kept her head and gained wealth. One person did not fare well from this episode: Thomas Cromwell. The failure of the Cleves marriage was humiliating for Henry, and he blamed Cromwell for it. That summer, on July 28, 1540, even as Henry celebrated his newfound freedom by wedding Catherine Howard, Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill. I watched from afar as the once powerful minister's head fell under the axe. It was chilling to see how swiftly Henry's favor could turn. Cromwell had engineered Anne Boleyn's downfall and the English Reformation. Yet he met a traitor's death, partly due to the Cleves fiasco. The king hardly seemed to mourn Cromwell. He was too enchanted with his fresh young bride Catherine that day. I mention this to illustrate how precarious life at Henry's court remained. A king's anger could be fatal, and that anger could be sparked by matters of the heart or matters of state, equally. In the end, Anne of Cleves was perhaps the luckiest of Henry's wives, paradoxically by not being his wife for long. She escaped with her honor and health intact, and even friendship with the king. Sometimes I would deliver letters between the king and Sister Anne, which contained cordial notes about hunting or the welfare of her estates. It warmed me to see a peaceful outcome for once. But Henry's marital saga was not over. He was already embarking on a dangerous liaison with a girl as young and carefree as Anne of Cleves had been sober and subdued. The court was about to be upended once more by youthful folly and royal fury. As I prepared to serve yet another new queen, I could only hope this one might finally bring lasting joy to Henry's life. Little did I suspect the tragedy that awaited. The marriage of King Henry VIII to Catherine Howard was like a brief summer storm. It began with intoxicating warmth and excitement, and ended in a crash of thunder and tragedy. Catherine was just a teenager, perhaps no more than 17 or 18, when she caught the king's eye. I remember her well. A pretty, vivacious girl with laughing eyes and a playful manner. She had joined Anne of Cleves's household as a lady-in-waiting late in 1539, placed there by her powerful Catholic uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. From the moment Catherine arrived at court, her youthful energy was infectious. She loved dancing, wearing bright jewels, and teasing the young gentlemen of the court. To King Henry, who was nearly 50 and had endured so much turmoil, Catherine must have seemed like a fresh rose in bloom. Thus he would later call her his rose without a thorn, tragically ironic in hindsight. Henry's infatuation with Catherine Howard blossomed in the spring of 1540, even before Anne of Cleves was cast aside. I observed the king's demeanor whenever Catherine was near. He straightened, smiled more, and a spark lit in his eyes. After the annulment from Anne was secured, Henry moved swiftly. On July 28, 1540, the same day Cromwell lost his head, Henry married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. The contrast could not have been greater. A man in his late 40s, stout and limping, and a teenage bride giggling with her ladies about her good fortune. Yet, at the time, many at court rejoiced. Catherine's youth and charm made the king radiantly happy, and a happy king meant a pleasant court. For a few months, indeed, the court was carefree again. We had merrymaking, nightly music, masks where the king, sporting a trimmed beard flecked with gray, gamely danced with his sprightly wife. Henry lavished Catherine with gifts, elegant gowns of French fashion, pearls, and land grants. The aging lion seemed rejuvenated by the marriage. As a servant, I appreciated the easier atmosphere. Henry's notorious temper was rarely on display when Catherine perched on his knee, whispering endearments in his ear. Queen Catherine, however, was young and impulsive. She was not well educated or particularly pious. Rather, she was fond of pleasures and flattery. I must say, she was kind enough to those who served her, tossing me an apple or sweetmeat now and then with a dazzling smile. But one could sense she lacked the maturity and prudence a queen needed. The older courtiers and ladies sometimes looked askance at her girlish antics. Still, the king was besotted, and would hear no criticism of his young kitten, as he affectionately dubbed her. He even forgave small lapses of decorum that would have enraged him in others. I recall once Catherine clapped her hands during chapel at a particularly joyous anthem. Some considered it improper, but Henry merely chuckled and patted her arm. That bright summer of 1541 was the zenith of Catherine Howard's queenship. King Henry took her on a grand progress through the north, partly to show off his delightful new queen, partly to soothe a region still wary after recent rebellions. I was among the entourage traveling from palace to palace. Catherine sparkled on this trip. She charmed local nobles with her dance steps and shared kindnesses, while Henry basked in pride. However, even amid the revelry, I began to notice subtle signs of indiscretion. Catherine had around her a group of young attendants, including a gentleman of the king's chamber named Thomas Culpeper. He was handsome and close to the queen in age. I often saw them speaking in hushed tones or exchanging knowing glances. It raised my brow, but I dismissed it. Surely the queen knew better than to behave improperly. And surely Culpeper, a king's favorite, would not cross that line. Rumors, however, have a way of seeping through keyholes. By autumn 1541, upon returning to London, whisperings reached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, about Catherine's past conduct and current behavior. It was alleged that before marrying the king, Catherine had been involved in illicit encounters, one with her music teacher, Henry Mannix, when she was barely a young girl, and later a more serious relationship with Frances Derham, a secretary in her grandmother's household. Moreover, now as queen, she was accused of secretly meeting Thomas Culpeper in private. At first, I refused to believe these slanders, but then, One All Saints' Day, November 1541. I observed the king reading a letter delivered by Archbishop Cranmer. Henry's face turned ashen, then red with anger. He abruptly left the chapel where he'd been attending Mass. We all knew something dire had occurred. Cranmer's letter had laid out the accusations. The king was devastated and furious. Yet he proceeded cautiously. He ordered an investigation while Catherine was kept under guarded watch in her apartments, ignorant at first of the storm about to hit. I was among those questioned. Everyone in the Queen's service was. They interrogated Derham and Culpeper as well. Under pressure, and some say under torture for Derham, confessions emerged. Derham admitted to a prior intimate relationship with Catherine before she became queen, claiming they had an understanding, a sort of informal engagement, which if true could nullify her marriage to Henry by law. Culpeper, meanwhile, admitted to private meetings with Catherine during 1541, though he maintained they did not consummate the affair, saying only intended and imagined ill happened. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother, was revealed to have helped arrange these secret meetings. It was all incredibly sordid and heartbreaking. For me, who had served Catherine daily, the revelations felt like whiplash. In hindsight, there had been signs, giggles among maids, hurried shut doors. But never did I imagine it was so serious. When the king learned the full truth, he was overwhelmed by grief and rage. Those near him said he wept and raged in equal measure, lamenting how he had been deceived and cuckolded by a mere girl. The pain of betrayal for Henry, who had truly loved Catherine's freshness, was intense. Soon that pain turned to vengeful resolve. Catherine Howard would face the fate of her cousin Anne Boleyn. I shall never forget the night Catherine was arrested at Hampton Court. As the guards approached, Catherine, realizing what was happening, broke free and supposedly ran screaming down the gallery, trying to reach the king to plead for mercy. It is said her ghost still haunts that haunted gallery. Such was the terror and pathos of that moment. I was at the far end of the hall and heard a piercing shriek and frantic cries of, "Henry, please, mercy," before the poor girl was apprehended by armed men. It was a chilling echo of Anne Boleyn's end, but somehow more pitiable because Catherine was so young and frightened out of her wits. The events after moved with grim efficiency. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen and imprisoned at Sion House. Many of her household, including myself, were dismissed and questioned. Lady Rochford and others implicated were sent to the Tower. Through December 1541, trials were held for Culpeper and Derham. Both men were found guilty of treasonous adultery with the Queen. The punishments were cruelly fitting the era. Thomas Culpeper was beheaded, a mercy perhaps due to his prior favor, and Francis Derham suffered the full, terrible traitor's death, hanged, drawn, and quartered in December 1541. I shuddered thinking of it. These were men I had seen laughing in the corridors not long ago. Their heads were displayed on London Bridge, a grisly warning. Even Queen Catherine, in her barge ride to the Tower in February 1542, would have passed under the bridge and seen the rotting heads of her former lovers mounted on pikes. What horror that must have been for her, if indeed she looked up. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. They say she was composed on the scaffold, asking for mercy on her soul and praying for the king's well-being. According to popular lore, though no eyewitness confirmed it, Catherine said she died a queen, but would rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper. Whether true or not, that sentiment floated through the court and haunted Henry's conscience. Alongside Catherine was executed Lady Jane Rochford, who had abetted her. Both were buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower, near the resting place of Anne Boleyn. The Howard family's ambitions had ended in blood once again. When news of Catherine's execution reached the king, he did not rejoice. Rather, Henry seemed melancholy and aged by the whole ordeal. I saw him the day after, Ash Wednesday it was, sitting alone in a chair by a window at Whitehall, gazing out at falling rain. Usually he would have been embarrassed to show sadness before a servant, but now he was beyond pretense. He looked at me and murmured, "If only she had been true. I loved her, Thomas." In that moment, I felt a wave of sympathy for my sovereign. Though many would call him foolish for marrying a child bride, and harsh for the punishment he meted out, Henry himself emerged wounded from the Catherine Howard affair. He had dared to feel young love again, and it betrayed him cruelly. I quietly replied, "I am sorry, Your Majesty," and withdrew. With Catherine Howard's death, the court fell into a hush. King Henry announced that for a while he would have no more wives. "For I see that all rest is vain, and I will busy myself with state and my children." He was humiliated and understandably wary of the marriage game now. He was also physically more broken. That winter of 1542, his leg ulcer worsened, and his weight increased significantly. We servants had to devise new ways to hoist him on horseback, and eventually a kind of mechanical chair was built to carry him up and down stairs. It was clear the king was not the spry youth of yesteryear, chasing maidens. He was an older, heavier man who had seen too much heartbreak. In my heart, I hoped Henry might find solace without another marriage. He had his long-sought male heir in Edward, and 2 daughters of great promise in Mary and Elizabeth. Though legally still bastards, Henry had not forgotten them entirely. Perhaps he could live out his days focusing on governance and family, without the turmoil a new queen might bring. And indeed, for over a year Henry remained single, an almost unprecedented pause for him. During this time, I noticed him growing more reflective. He spent more time with Prince Edward, guiding his education, and also brought the Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth to court more often, especially at Christmastide 1543, where the royal children all celebrated together under their father's watchful gaze. Those were heartening scenes, seeing Henry with his offspring around him, perhaps realizing that these children were the true legacy that would live on. Yet, fate had one more wife in store for King Henry, a final companion to comfort him in his twilight. As 1543 advanced, rumors swelled that the king's eye had turned to a wise and gracious lady who had already been twice widowed. Enter Catherine Parr, a woman unlike any prior, neither girl nor foreign princess, but an Englishwoman of mature years and good sense. I was cautiously optimistic. Perhaps this time, with God's grace, Henry would find the steady, caring partnership he so badly needed. By the year 1543, King Henry VIII had weathered many storms. He was graying, heavier, and often in pain, yet still every inch the imposing monarch. What he lacked was a steady hand to guide him through his final years, and in Catherine Parr he found just that. Catherine Parr was a remarkable lady. 30 years old to Henry's 52, she had been twice married and twice widowed. I remember first seeing her at court in early 1543 when she served as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Mary. Catherine had an air of calm intelligence. She was not a classic beauty like some predecessors, but there was warmth and dignity in her demeanor. Brown-haired, with kind hazel eyes, she carried herself with the assured grace of a woman who knew the world. Unlike the giggling Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr could engage the king in thoughtful conversation, something Henry greatly valued as his zest for youthful frolics waned. It was said that Catherine Parr had caught the king's attention while he visited Lady Mary's household. Interestingly, she had been in love with Sir Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane, around that time. But when Henry, the king himself, proposed marriage, Catherine felt duty-bound to accept. She was a pragmatist, understanding the risk of refusing the king, and perhaps sensing she could do much good as queen. In private, Catherine later admitted she had resolved to become not a stepmother, but a loving mother to Henry's children. Truly, her compassion was her guiding star. Henry and Catherine Parr were married on July 12, 1543, in a quiet ceremony at Hampton Court. As a servant in attendance, I saw a different king than at previous weddings. There was no youthful giddiness, no showy pageantry. Henry appeared stately and a bit solemn, though content. Catherine, elegant in rich purple velvet, the color of royalty, knelt and kissed the king's hand with respect. This marriage was built on mutual esteem and understanding rather than passion. It was a new kind of union for Henry. From the first days of her queenship, Catherine Parr proved a balm to the king and the realm. She possessed a keen intellect. She could discourse on theology and humanist learning. I often saw her in the evenings reading to Henry from the scriptures in English or from devotional books she herself wrote. Remarkably, Catherine Parr would become the first Queen of England to publish a book under her own name during her lifetime. The king, who had theological interests and had authored religious treatises in his youth, appreciated Catherine's learned nature. They spent many comfortable hours together discussing matters of faith, reform, and the education of the royal children. Catherine took a sincere interest in Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. She brought the two princesses back to court and ensured they were treated with honor. I recall a touching scene at Christmas 1543. Queen Catherine led little Elizabeth, who was around 10, by hand to join her siblings in a holiday masque. Henry watched, tears in his eyes, as all three of his children performed a little song for him. Such a harmonious family tableau might never have happened without Catherine Parr's gentle engineering. She even persuaded Henry to restore Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, though still officially illegitimate, through the Third Succession Act of 1543. To see Henry formally acknowledge his daughters again brought joy to many of us who had served the royal children in happier times. Life in the palace under Catherine Parr took on a more wholesome and scholarly tone. The Queen was very pious in a reformist way, not radically Protestant, but leaning towards the new learning. She convened learned men for discussions, patronized the translation of Psalms into English, and herself wrote Prayers or Meditations, published in 1545. I was one of those tasked with delivering copies of this book to the king's courtiers. Henry was proud of his wife's accomplishments. He even encouraged her to act as regent in 1544 when he left England to campaign against France. This was a great mark of trust. Only Catherine of Aragon before had ever been named regent in Henry's reign. Catherine Parr performed the regency admirably, issuing proclamations and keeping the realm stable while Henry sieged Boulogne in France. I noted that the council, initially skeptical of a woman at its head, grew to respect her firm yet reasoned leadership. That summer of 1544 felt secure at home despite the king's absence, thanks to Catherine's steady hand. However, Catherine's religious enthusiasm nearly led her into danger. In 1546, conservative factions at court, who disliked her Protestant sympathies, plotted to turn the king against her. Henry's aging mind was sometimes suspicious, and indeed, he was presented with evidence that Catherine engaged in theological debates with him perhaps too boldly. I recall one tense evening where the king had quarreled with Catherine during a discussion on religion. He later confided to an adviser that the queen might be overstepping herself. This was fanned by her enemies. Unbeknownst to Catherine, a warrant for her arrest was drawn up. When I learned of this brewing trouble, my heart sank. Would we witness yet another queen fall? But Catherine Parr's wisdom saved her. Somehow she caught wind that Henry was displeased. The very next day, Catherine humbly approached the king, professing that she only discussed religion with him to take his mind off his pains, and to learn from him, not to instruct him. Henry, who likely had been testing her or was wavering, embraced her and declared he knew she was a good woman. When the Lord Chancellor arrived awkwardly with the arrest warrant soon after, Henry famously dismissed him angrily, saying he and the council were fools to think he would ever proceed against his loving wife. I was nearby when this happened. The king's loud shouts of indignation echoed through the halls. Catherine's quick wit and submission had reconciled the king to her just in time. That night, I saw Henry and Catherine walking in the garden together, Henry leaning on her arm, both laughing gently at something. Danger had passed. The court breathed a sigh of relief. We all loved Queen Catherine and did not wish to see another tragedy. The last years of King Henry's life, with Catherine Parr by his side, were more peaceful than those before. Not without issues, the war with France dragged on, and Henry's health continued to decline. But domestically there was calm. The king's ulcers and ill health worsened as 1546 turned to 1547. His once towering frame had grown obese. Some said he weighed nearly 28 stone, and he could barely walk due to his ulcerated legs. I often helped gently wrap his swollen legs in clean bandages soaked in balm. The king endured terrible pain, yet would still roar with laughter at a well-told jest or light up when young Edward showed him a new skill in Latin. Catherine Parr nursed him devotedly. She arranged for physicians, ensured he took whatever remedies might ease him, and, most importantly, she kept his spirits up. She would read poetry or scripture aloud in a soothing voice during his bad days. Henry, in those moments, looked at her with gratitude that needed no words. I think he realized that in Catherine Parr He had found a wife who truly cared for him as a person, not as a king or for his favors. A companionship he had perhaps never fully had before. On a cold January night in 1547, it became clear Henry was dying. He lay in his great bed at Whitehall Palace, laboring for breath, the room heavy with the scent of medicines and candles. Prince Edward, only 9 years old, was brought to the bedside, as were Mary and Elizabeth, to receive their father's blessing. I stood at the back, tears in my eyes, as the king muttered loving words to each of his children. Catherine Parr was there too, holding Henry's hand tightly. Shortly before midnight on January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII passed from this world. He was 55 years old. In his will, he left provisions for Catherine to be honored as Queen Dowager, and granted her a generous allowance. He also desired to be buried beside Jane Seymour at Windsor, as he had always intended. I spent that night kneeling in prayer in the chapel, my heart heavy yet strangely at peace. King Henry's turbulent journey had ended. I had served him from the days of his dazzling youth, through all 6 marriages, through triumphs, betrayals, births and deaths, laughter and fury. Now he was gone, leaving a boy king to rule and a legacy that would be debated for ages. But in those quiet moments, I did not think of the politics or the religious upheavals. I thought of the man I knew. I remembered Henry's hearty laugh echoing in the tilt yard, his strong arm on my shoulder in a gesture of thanks after I'd tightened his armor before a joust. I recalled how tenderly he cradled each newborn child, and how bitterly he wept in private when those he loved were lost. Few saw these facets, but I did. I had seen King Henry in his glory and in his darkest hours. He was, to me, not just the larger-than-life figure of chronicles, but a flawed, passionate, vibrant man whom I served and, in my own way, cared for. Catherine Parr, widowed a 4th time at age 35, would later find her personal happiness. She quietly married her old love, Thomas Seymour, some months after Henry's death. I visited her household once during Edward's reign. She seemed content, though fate dealt her a final cruel blow when she died after childbirth in 1548. But she had fulfilled her duty in guiding the king to his end with grace. And what of the other queen's legacies? Catherine of Aragon's daughter Mary would become queen in time, restoring her mother's faith, though with fire and blood. Anne Boleyn's daughter Elizabeth would ascend the throne after and reign gloriously, proving the value of the very girl Henry had once set aside. Jane Seymour's son, Edward VI, reigned briefly, a bright flame snuffed out by illness while still a teen. Anne of Cleves lived quietly on, respected and comfortable, fondly remembered as the one wife who survived Henry unscathed. Catherine Howard remained a cautionary tale of youthful indiscretion. Her tragedy would be recounted in hushed tones as a lesson, and Catherine Parr would be lauded for her learnedness and composure, a model for future royal consorts. As for me, Thomas the Servant, I lived out my years seeing the dawn of young King Edward's rule, the swing back to Catholic Queen Mary, and the rise of brilliant Queen Elizabeth. But as an old man, I often found myself lost in reminiscence of the king who killed his wives, a harsh epithet that only tells part of the story. Yes, I had seen 2 queens beheaded by Henry's command, and 2 queens heartbreakingly divorced, and I would never defend the cruelty or impulsiveness of those acts. Yet I also saw the human heart of King Henry, a man desperately seeking an heir and true companionship, capable of deep love but also burning wrath. Now, in my twilight, I walk sometimes in the empty palace galleries at night, and I almost fancy I hear their footsteps. Catherine of Aragon's measured tread as she goes to kneel in the chapel, Anne Boleyn's lively French giggle echoing down the privy stairs, Jane Seymour's soft voice singing a lullaby to Prince Edward, Anne of Cleves humming a German tune as she cheerfully packs for her new estates, Catherine Howard's slippers pattering in a forbidden late-hour tryst, Catherine Parr's quill scratching on parchment as she writes her devotions by candlelight. They are shades of the past, each queen etched in my memory with her own hue and light. In the great Abbey of Westminster, a poem was later inscribed of King Henry's reign, concluding with the line, "Henry VIII, whose famous kingly name writes stories full of wife and wives' mischance." Indeed, the saga of his 6 wives became legend, a tale of divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, as people often recite. I sometimes wince at that rhyme, for it reduces these women. They are shades of the past, each queen etched in my memory with her own hue and light. In the great Abbey of Westminster, a poem was later inscribed of King Henry's reign, concluding with the line, "Henry VIII, whose famous kingly name writes stories full of wife and wives' mischance." Indeed, the saga of his 6 wives became legend, often reduced to a simple rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. I sometimes wince at that jingle, for it diminishes these women to a mere chant, when to me each was a living soul I served and cared for. Catherine of Aragon, proud and steadfast, whom I honored as a true queen. Anne Boleyn, bold and beguiling, who changed England even in death. Jane Seymour, gentle peacemaker, the beloved mother of the precious son. Anne of Cleves, kind and wise, who found friendship where rejection loomed. Catherine Howard, young and free-spirited, whose tragedy broke my heart. And Catherine Parr, compassionate and learned, who healed a king's spirit in his final days. As I lay down my quill and close this book of memories, the palace around me is quiet. The flicker of my candle casts dancing shadows on the tapestry-hung wall, almost as if the silhouettes of those queens keep vigil with me. Outside, beyond the casement, I hear the distant refrain of a lullaby, perhaps just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps the echo of Queen Jane soothing her babe, or Catherine Howard's ghost pleading for mercy in the gallery one last time. I bow my head and murmur a prayer for each of them, and for King Henry too. Time has passed, and wounds have healed into history. King Henry's children reign in turn, forging their own paths and destinies from the legacies of their mothers. In my dreams, I often return to those halcyon days of my youth, when a golden young Henry rode out with Catherine of Aragon by his side under the summer sun, and we all believed in fairy tale endings. Life taught us otherwise, yet there was beauty amidst the sorrow. The king who killed his wives also loved them in his own flawed way. Each at one time was the apple of his eye, his most dear lady. I, Thomas, have been privileged and cursed to witness it all. And now, at the end of this tale, I find my eyes heavy with both tears and the weariness of years. So, gentle listener, You who have kept faith with an old servant's story till the last, take from it this. Great Henry Tudor was a man, as frail and mortal as any of us, for all the crown upon his head. In his story there is glory and infamy, sweetness and bitterness entwined. And in the telling of it, perhaps we find not judgment alone, but understanding. As I douse my candle and the room falls into soft darkness, I feel a strange peace. The ghosts of the past seem to bow and take their leave, one by one. A final image lingers in my mind. King Henry VIII in his twilight, sitting in the palace garden with quiet Catherine Parr. Little Prince Edward on his knee. Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth at his feet, and the sun setting gently on the bygone golden age of our Tudor king. Good night, dear ladies. Good night, sweet princes. The tale is told, and the kingdom sleeps. May you find rest, and may your memories live on in the silence of these halls and the whispers of history evermore.